Hello, I'm Andrew, the Young Adult and Media Librarian at North Brunswick Public Library. And part of my job is, of course, the collection development of our audiobooks. And I'm very happy to be here with a very prolific audiobook narrator, Elizabeth Klett. Now, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the process that goes into making an audiobook. I think some people would be interested in this. Now, people watching at home might be wondering, her voice sounds familiar. Where have I heard it before? Well, if you go on to Hoopla, let me just share the screen for that. Here, I'll show you that. This is Hoopla. This is what the North Brunswick Library card. Yeah, are you able to see this, Liz?
I am, yeah.
Okay, this is what North Brunswick Library cards can stream a lot of books and audiobooks as well as ebooks and videos and music here. So if I'm going to see what we have with the voice of Elizabeth Klett on it. And we're going to get a pretty wide variety of titles here, right? Some of them have pretty steamy titles, I must say. If we go to the second page, you can see just how diverse some of them are. Keepers of the Labyrinth, Strawberry Meringue Cupcake and Murder, The House of the Vampire, Dirty Irish, and here's one that looks pretty interesting, The Ultimate Star Trek and Philosophy. So is this something that you enjoy? Do you enjoy having a variety of genres and things to narrate?
Yeah, definitely. In part, it's a little bit contingent on just what I get offered.
Okay.
And I do tend to get offered mostly fiction.
Mhm.
So the Star Trek essay collection, which I just did recently, it was actually a co-narration. Just was a little random, but I was excited to do it because I'm a Star Trek fan from way back. So that was fun. But that's a pretty atypical project for me. I tend to mostly narrate fiction, a lot of historical fiction, a lot of actually British historical fiction. Um, so, I mean, I think sometimes people probably ask me to do a project because I have a sort of niche. But I do tend to do a lot of sci-fi fantasy as well, which I really enjoy. So it's possible that led to the Star Trek collection.
Great. And does your background includes not only theater but English literature as well? You are a professor of English literature too.
Yes,
So
that's right.
do you find that that's useful
I
in your
do.
role as a narrator?
Definitely. I mean, I think in many ways the two kind of inform each other, often in unexpected ways. I started out narrating as a volunteer for the website LibriVox.org, and they do free public domain audiobooks. So your patrons will can certainly access those as well for free anytime on the web. But often what I would record for LibriVox were classics that I teach. So I recorded a lot of Jane Austen, and I do teach a class on Jane Austen. I did a lot of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's my sort of area of expertise. I teach Shakespeare a lot, but oftentimes I'll kind of incorporate books into my teaching that I've recorded, which is kind of nice. And Yeah, so sometimes there's a kind of crossover. Right now, for example, I'm working on a project that I kind of designed. So I'm doing a collection of fairy tales, and it's through a company called Spoken Realms that I work with sometimes, and they just kind of take project proposals. So I decided I wanted to do this kind of curated collection of fairy tales, in part because I teach a class on fairy tales. So yeah, it's fun.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were in the production of Into the Woods at Drew University, weren't you?
I was,
Yes.
yes. Although I wasn't supposed to be. I think I replaced somebody.
Oh, okay.
It was my freshman year, so somebody got sick or couldn't do it, and they brought me in the last 2 weeks, and I got to play the grandmother in
Right.
Little Red Riding Hood and the giant, although that was just the voice, in the Jack and the Beanstalk story, and then Cinderella's mother.
Hmm. I
So
actually, yeah, I actually directed a production back in I think 2006, actually.
fun.
But you probably know that that particular musical, a lot of the ideas come from Bruno Bettelheim, right?
Definitely.
And the
Yeah.
thoughts about fairy tales and things like that. One thing I would like to know, I think a lot of people would like to know is what goes into the creation of an audiobook, including your job, really.
There are a lot of stages. So there's the sort of the business end of it where I'm either offered a book or there's some kind of negotiation process. There's a lot of kind of things that happen on the front end until I actually have a contract. But then at that point, I'll get the manuscript and I'll do a preparation period with the manuscript. So sometimes that involves some fairly extensive research. So depending on what the book is, I might need to do a lot of prep to identify, pronunciations. For example, it might actually involve talking with the author sometimes, or getting notes from the author about what they, envision for the book. Um, Often, really, though, they kind of let me do my job, and those notes are just sort of to help me out and often to give me pronunciations. If it's a fantasy book that has a lot of made up names, then I definitely want the author to tell me, how they want them to sound.
Mm.
That's helpful. And then at that point, once I've done the prep, it's really just a lot of hours in the booth. And then depending on whether or not I'm editing and mastering it myself, then there's that stage at the end. I do work for some companies where I just give them the raw audio files and they do the editing and mastering. But I do a lot of projects where I'm also doing the editing and doing the mastering and the sort of delivery of the final files as well. So then there's that on the back end. And so I think the general assumption that listeners should have is that for every finished hour of audio that they hear, there's probably about 3 hours of work that goes towards the actual creation of that at a minimum, sometimes more, just depending on the project.
So do you record in your own studio usually, or go to another studio?
I record at home, as a lot of narrators do now, and I do have a little booth. It's basically a tiny closet in a bedroom in my home, and I've turned it into a recording studio, and so I get to just kind of go in there, and it's tiny windowless box, and it's not air conditioned, so in the summer it gets very hot. Right now, I live in Texas, so right now it's a little punishing, but it's worth it.
And did you ever have an experience where you made a recording and then you got feedback that something had to be done over?
Yes, definitely. It doesn't happen that often, thank goodness. The way that we try to avoid that is that there's a kind of approval process up front. So usually, for most of the companies I work for, um, there's a kind of it's sort of part of the negotiation process in some ways up front, that you have to submit some files and the publisher or the author or the rights holder has to approve it, and then once they've approved, you kind of go ahead and do the rest of the book. I should say, though, that all audiobooks have corrections. I guess I missed that out in the in my description of the process, but all audiobooks have corrections. I've never done a single audiobook where there hasn't been something that has to be, corrected. So there is a proof listening process where there's an actual proofer who will go through and listen to everything and make notes. And, you just kind of hope that they don't find too much for you to do and fix on the back end.
So you've never gotten a comment where they said, okay, can you do it all again, but this time we want you to do it in Klingon accent?
No.
Okay.
That's thank goodness. I've heard horror stories of things like that from other narrators. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's what the kind of approval process at the front end is designed to avoid.
Right.
And I've never experienced anything quite that bad myself. So
Okay.
not yet.
Well, I'm glad that you haven't experienced anything that bad. Of course, bad experiences do make for good stories.
Yeah,
And,
that's true.
And so how do you take care of your voice, considering that you have to speak for hours on end?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do some vocal warm-up exercises, actually going back to my theater studies at Drew. So I actually never thought once I, started my career as an academic that I'd be really using any of those classes again. But I do vocal warm-up exercises. And I also just try to pace myself. So I kind of have learned over the years that I really can't do more than about 2 hours of finished audio in a day. And it really does vary. So if I'm teaching on that day as well, then it'll be even more limited, or maybe I just won't do any narration work that day. And it'll really just depend on the schedule. Over the summer, it's usually pretty good. I can be pretty consistent with my audio work because I'm not teaching. I'm usually writing over the summer. And so that doesn't tax the voice, fortunately. But yeah, I sort of try to pace myself. Often I will try to aim for between 1 and 2 hours of recording work a day.
Now, do you have a preference in terms of whether you want to be doing newer books or classics?
I like them both. I feel at this point that I've probably narrated most of the classics that I really would have liked to narrate. And that's just because I did so many for LibriVox. I did about 60 solos for them, where it was just me reading the book. I did a lot more projects where that were group projects where there were other people involved. But and I think when I did the LibriVox work, I really got to read pretty much everything that I could have imagined that I would have wanted to narrate. I have gotten to go back and redo a couple of them, which has been nice. I did 2 Jane Austen novels professionally a few years ago. I narrated Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. And I think if I were given the chance to do, more Austen professionally, I would certainly take it. And there's probably a couple other classics that if somebody said, hey, could you do this now? I would say, sure. Especially because, I'm, proud of my LibriVox work, but I was working as a volunteer at the time. I didn't have professional equipment. I was also a lot less experienced. So definitely you can hear the difference between, my work as a LibriVox volunteer and my work now. I do work for an organization right now called the Online Stage, which is a fun group. And we tend to produce a lot of dramatic readings of classic novels, meaning that it's a sort of full cast experience. So you have a narrator, and then you have actors reading the different characters' dialogue. And so we've done all of Austen that way. And I've narrated, like right now, I'm doing a few books for them where I'm narrating some of my favorite classics, like we're doing The Secret Garden and A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And then I'm doing The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. And I think next year we're going to be doing Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, because it will be finally in the public domain. So that kind of scratches the classics itch, I guess you could say. But then I love doing new books. New books are great. And I'm always excited when there's a new series that I can kind of get attached to. And if it, I'm always hoping that, if a series is successful, that it'll keep going and I'll keep being able to narrate them.
Great. And you're also a writer as well.
Oh, well, I'm an academic writer.
That counts. That counts.
Yeah. I have published 2 books as a professor. So I just actually published my second book last year. It's a book about Shakespeare and dance adaptation. And so both my books are on Shakespeare and performance. So again, kind of going back to that theater studies background, and which is nice. Academic writing is such a weird beast, though, because it takes such a long time. It's so highly specialized. It has such a small audience. So it's almost like, I mean, of course yes, I write, but I almost don't even think of myself as a writer. It's kind of strange. It's taken me long enough to consider myself an actor. I still almost kind of don't, that doesn't quite, kind of seem to fit me, but I have to say, like, yes, you are an actor. You are a voice actor. So.
Okay. Have you ever done any animation about voice acting, or?
I would love to. No, I haven't. I've kind of, I did pursue some sort of non-audio book related voice work for a couple of years. And I did do a couple of voices for some really tiny video games.
Okay. Well, that's fun. That's fun.
It is fun, but I've never been in a studio doing animation voiceover, and I'd love to someday. We'll see.
Well, yeah, I mean, you just have to make an animated version of Persuasion.
Right.
There you go. Yes, there you go. Yes. Okay, great. All right. So thank you very much, Liz. All our North Brunswick Library patrons are encouraged to listen to some of her audiobook narrations on Hoopla. And if please leave any feedback. So thank you very much and for coming by, and have a great evening.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for asking me. It was fun.
Oh, my pleasure.